Welcome to this evening's special talk by Caryl Phillips, Cities by the Water, Postcolonial History and Participation of Newcomers. My name is Janice Serra, and I'm the director of the Peter Wall Institute for Advanced Studies at the University of British Columbia. And the Institute is dedicated to advancing innovative thinking around issues that are sort of big ideas or important societal issues, and to eventually lead to innovative solutions. And this talk is part of a series of international roundtables that we're currently holding on everything from speculative cities to bonding and health issues related to incarcerated mothers, to how one inculcates Indigenous learning into our other kinds of methodologies about learning and teaching. I want to thank CBC Radio 1 and producer Yvonne Gall and her crew for taping the event this evening for a Future Ideas podcast. And I want to just take a second to thank also Joanne Forbes and the rest of my staff for making this evening happen. Given that it's a talk about cities, I thought I would take just 1 minute to talk about this building, the Law Courts, in case you've never been here. It was initially conceptualized as a 50-story building. And in fact, just as construction was about to begin, there was a government change and a concept design change. And Arthur Erickson, in fact, turned the idea on its side. So what he said was, rather than a corporate monument, he would create a high-rise on its side and integrate elements of nature. So that he wanted to let people walk on it as opposed to look up at it. The building opened in 1980. It has 35 courtrooms. The glass that above you covers more than an acre. And his colleague, landscape architect Cornelia Oberlander, was the first to incorporate nature in Vancouver in terms of structural design. And of course, it was meant to be open to everyone, just as the justice system was meant to be open to everyone. I thought that would get a laugh. The program this evening is fairly straightforward. Caryl Phillips will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have about 40-minute question and answer period. There's a microphone in the center there, and so we'll end about 7:25 promptly. So now to introduce our guest speaker. Caryl Phillips was born in St. Kitts and migrated to Britain at the ripe old age of 4 months. He grew up in Leeds and studied English literature at Oxford University. He began for writing for theatre, and subsequently won a number of prizes for his plays, radio theatre, and then dramas, documentaries, and screenplays for radio, television, and film. He's written 10 novels, many of which are familiar to us tonight, including Crossing the River, which was shortlisted for the Booker Prize, and a host of others. He's written 4 nonfiction books, the most recent, Color Me English, in 2011, which is a series of reflective essays on themes of belonging and exclusion. His literary awards are many, including the Martin Luther King Memorial Prize, a Guggenheim Fellowship, and the prestigious James Tate Black Memorial Prize. Formerly Henry Luce Professor of Migration and Social Order at Columbia University, he is presently Professor of English at Yale University and an Honorary Fellow of Queen's College, Oxford University. Professor Phillips has observed that often a city's history and its DNA bear an influence on those who arrive as newcomers. It is a theme that resonates here and internationally. Please join me in welcoming Caryl Phillips.
First of all, I just want to say thank you to everybody connected to the Peter Wall Institute for Advanced Studies, all of whom, over the many months of planning my particular event, but obviously the other events as well, thank you, the other events as well, have been incredibly supportive, have made me feel very welcome, and I've greatly enjoyed the privilege of working with the Institute. As Dr. Saris says, I'm going to talk for perhaps about 40 minutes or so, and then you're going to ask me some very easy questions from the floor. So let's just see how this goes. There's a moment towards the end of the Trinidadian writer Samuel Selvon's short story, My Girl and the City, where the migrant hero, adrift in the cold and somewhat hostile city of London in the 1950s, somewhat surprisingly begins to declare his love for the city. Once again, he says, I'm on a train returning to the heart from the suburbs, and I look out of the window. The train crawls across the bridges, the thoughtful gloom of Waterloo, Charing Cross Bridge, Thames, reflecting lights and the silhouettes of city buildings against the sky of night. When I was in New York, many times I went into the city late at night after a sally to the outskirts. It lighted up with a million lights, but never a feeling as on entering London. That migrants should have a hard time adjusting to a new city is not surprising, but that they should have a hard time yet continue to feel a powerful affection toward the city is somewhat surprising. But this is not just a feature of Selvon's work. It's true to the experience of many immigrants to Britain who have spoken or written about their feelings of affection for their new cities. As an immigrant twice over, once to Britain and then again to the United States, the question of how, and indeed why, one might feel affection for a city in the face of overwhelming evidence of rejection has always interested me. Thinking about it has led me to consider that there are, of course, different types of migrants, just as there are different types of cities. And tonight, in this talk, I want to consider a particular type of migrant who is actually now becoming something of an endangered species, the colonial migrant. The writer Samuel Selvon, who was born in Trinidad in 1923 and who went to London as a 27-year-old man in 1950, was very much a colonial migrant. Trinidad was a colony. Independence didn't come until 1962. Furthermore, my parents, who came to Britain at the end of the 50s with me as their hand luggage, they too were colonial migrants. If you look around the streets of London or Paris or Amsterdam, you will see colonial migrants from the Caribbean, from Africa, from Asia, but you will also see a far greater number of political and economic migrants from all corners of the world, which is, of course, what you're familiar with here in Canada. You didn't have colonies, so you don't have colonial migrants. However, these are the people I want to briefly consider in this talk, for they have a very peculiar relationship to the cities to which they migrate, and their experiences can perhaps be instructive about the migrant experience in the broadest context. I grew up in Britain at a time of great social unrest and upheaval. My generation, the children of colonial migrants to Britain, had no great love for the cities that were our home, for we felt that the cities were rejecting us, and, much to the distress of our parents, we played out our frustrations with violence and rebellion on the streets. Our disaffection was palpable. But I also grew up in Britain not just as a frustrated, non-white child of immigrant parents. I also grew up as a lover of literature. And on encountering the writing of Selvon and others, I was always deeply puzzled by the affection for Britain that was expressed by these colonial migrant writers. Clearly, these old guys had a serious problem. Couldn't they see that the city, in fact, the country, just didn't like them and didn't want them? And so why on earth were they trying so hard to belong when the overwhelming evidence was that they would never belong? I'm going to try and look at this question of belonging to a city through the prism of two cities which lie on important rivers. I'm going to look at Leeds, a northern working-class city in Yorkshire, which was the city to which my parents migrated, and London, the largest city in Europe and one which needs little introduction. I have a claim to be able to call both of these places home, should I choose to do so. But maybe by looking at the story of one migrant in the case of Leeds and one extraordinary novel of migration in the case of London, I'll be able to steer the talk towards the heart of my own feelings about the way in which colonial migrants deal with these vexing issues of belonging and participation once they've made the courageous decision to cross the water and try to stitch the narrative of their own lives into the larger narratives of the cities to which they've traveled. Let's begin with Leeds. I left the city in the 70s to go to university. However, the formative years of my life were spent in Leeds. I learnt to read and write there. I went to my first schools there. I learnt to love football there. I went to my first music gigs there. I went to my first pub there. I began to understand who and what I was in the city. I mentioned that Leeds is in the county of Yorkshire, which is not just a geographical description. By mentioning this fact, I'm also signaling something about the parochialism of the environment in which I grew up. Yorkshire is a very insular county. The ethos of us and them is strong. And when I was a boy, the county's sense of its own place was being reinscribed by all sorts of clumsy mechanisms, perhaps the most potent of which was the fact that you were forbidden to play cricket for the county unless you were born there. Mercifully, this has now changed, but as a youngster growing up in Yorkshire who loved sport but who wasn't born in the county, this barrier to participation was a daily reminder that in some ways I simply didn't belong. I was an outsider. There were other, more potent signifiers of exclusion, but as I said, I loved sport, and this official policy of exclusion stung. In the late 60s in Leeds, an event took place which cast a long shadow over the city, and sadly, it earned the city I called home a national notoriety. A young Nigerian-born migrant to the city, David Olawale, was found dead in the River Aire, which is the city that flows through the center of Leeds. Upon closer examination of the events surrounding his death, it was discovered that for many years this poor man had been systematically harassed by the Leeds City Police Force. As a result of this discovery, his death was soon been investigated as a criminal offense. However, before going any further with the story of David Olawale, I think it's perhaps best to put these events into some kind of context by looking a little at the history of Leeds as a city and as a city of migration. Ironically enough, if it were not for the river that runs through the center of Leeds, there would be no city. Put simply, the city exists because of the river. 2,000 years ago, the Romans built a road from York in the east to Manchester in the west, and at the point where the road traverses the River Aire, they constructed a crossing. Around this crossing grew a settlement, and by the 18th century, Leeds was a substantial place with a population of 7,000 and another 3,000 in the outlying townships. By the mid-19th century, the population of Victorian Leeds had swelled to 150,000, and in 1847, a huge Gothic prison was built to cope with the ever-growing numbers of so-called undesirables. By 1858, Leeds was able to flaunt a new town hall, which was one of the largest civic buildings in Europe, a place that was impressive enough for Queen Victoria herself to come and open it. The four bold words that are carved around the vestibule of the 19th century town hall Europe, Asia, Africa, America, reminded the people of Leeds that the globe was the true sphere of influence for the British, and Victorian Leeds was perfectly positioned to take advantage of this fortuitous fact. The making of cloth was of vital importance to the town, but Leeds was also becoming well known as the workshop of the world. Hundreds of factories produced bicycles, cranes, sewing machines, trains, axles, bricks, and much more. Along the river, there were scores of furnaces burning every day, and the skyline was dominated by chimneys and the air choked with pollution. But while Leeds gave to the world, she also took from the world. By the late 1840s, a small community of middle-class German Jews had established themselves in Leeds, but the Jewish migrants that followed in their wake were largely poor Jews from Eastern Europe. They would arrive at Hull and make their way west to Leeds in the hope of finding some kind of occupation in the clothing industry, for many of them were skilled tailors. And then there were the Irish, thousands of whom arrived in the wake of the great famines of the 1840s and congregated in the East End of Leeds, in slums of great deprivation. The Irish, the Jews, and later the West Indians, the West Africans, the Pakistanis, the Poles, and many others would come. Immigrants flowed into Leeds and slowly took their place in the order of things. But life was never easy for any immigrant group. Of course, people were discriminated against. They were stared at. They were made to feel that they were an outsider, made to feel ashamed of who they were. But Leeds offered one thing that everybody wanted and was prepared to pay the price for: opportunity. In Leeds, there did exist the possibility of transforming oneself from what you were into what you hoped to become. In this sense, the city was a place of magical possibilities, a place with jobs and potential. To arrive in grey, grim, bleak Leeds was to arrive at a place of hope, and so they came. In 1949, David Olawale arrived in Leeds. A young 19-year-old boy, he stowed away from Lagos, Nigeria, and landed at Hull. In those days, an arrival in Britain as a stowaway was immediately rewarded with a 28-day sentence. It transpired that the courts in Hull decided that this young lad, who harbored ambitions of becoming an engineer, should serve out his sentence in the imposing Victorian structure that was the prison in Leeds. Upon his release, he found digs near Leeds University and began working at a car factory that made mouldings for top-of-the-line models. During the evenings, David Olawale began to study, and some kind of a routine was established. He was a quiet man. He kept himself to himself, although he liked dancing and the camaraderie of the pub. However, he wasn't much of a drinker, and at the end of an evening, he liked to walk home by himself. It's probably worth emphasizing that a colored immigrant to Leeds was a rare thing in the immediate post-war years. According to the 1951 census, there were only 107 West Indians and 45 Africans in the city. Unfortunately, the extremely visible David Olawale now found himself attracting the hostility of gangs of young louts and the Leeds City police force. However, what made this Nigerian different from the others was that he would answer back. And Olawale consistently failed what the Leeds City police force termed the attitude test. And I'm sure you can imagine what this was. By the early 50s, Olawale had racked up a series of court appearances and convictions on minor trespassing and disorderly conduct charges, and he'd returned to prison on numerous occasions. However, he wasn't a man to be broken by this treatment. On June the 11th, 1953, the system found another way to control the young Nigerian immigrant, and he was committed to the West Riding Pauper Lunatic Asylum just outside Leeds. Thereafter, he was sedated and underwent electroshock therapy treatment, which, during the 8 years in which he was incarcerated, radically changed the young man's personality and radically changed his sense of himself. Upon his release, he had nowhere to live, and so he took to the streets of Leeds, a city that was now the only home that he knew. Predictably enough, he was subjected to more harassment from the police, who made it clear that they didn't want this black vagrant on their streets. He was regularly removed from the city centre, beaten and left on the outskirts of the city, sometimes in woods, sometimes in neighbouring towns, but he always made his way back on foot into the centre of Leeds. Clearly, some of Olawale's problems could have been solved if he'd either found a roof for himself or just left the city altogether. But he was stubborn and independent. People tried to help, but he wanted to do things his own way, and so he continued to wander the streets of Leeds and remain visible, which left him in constant danger of being terrorized by members of the police force. On May the 4th, 1969, a Leeds police frogman recovered his body from the River Aire, some 3 miles east of the city centre. As he pulled the body from the river, he noticed a large lump on Olawale's forehead, bleeding from an eye, a bruise on the right upper arm, and the fact that David Olawale's lips were cut. Olawale had drowned, that much was evident, but it was also apparent that this man, who had a profound fear of water and who could not swim, would not have voluntarily jumped into the river. 2 years later, a trial was held which resulted in the imprisonment of 2 Leeds City police officers for assaulting the immigrant. In the absence of any witnesses, it wasn't possible to try either policeman for murder or manslaughter, but the details of the case and the sentencing of the 2 policemen received national attention and shocked people in Leeds. Really, what kind of a way was this to treat a stranger to one's city? My home city of Leeds rejected this migrant in the most brutal fashion. Friends and some social work agencies did try to help him, but there's no getting around the fact that the city looked the other way while this man was cast literally onto the waters. But back in the late 60s, the city of Leeds was busy, and the city stood on the threshold of a transformation that has finally come to pass. Dark, grim, soot-blackened buildings would soon be sandblasted clean or torn down. New concrete and office block buildings and modern sprawling estates were being planned. The city would soon begin the process of regeneration. The city was busy. But that's part of the problem with regeneration of Leeds, or perhaps the regeneration of any city. Somebody forgot to include the people. But that's another story altogether. In the late 90s, I found myself back in Leeds quite regularly. I took these occasions to walk around the city centre and to retrace the route I used to walk as a schoolboy, trudging my way across town from my city centre bus stop to school. On one of these visits, I was astonished to realize that the very doorways that the homeless David Olawale sought shelter in were the doorways that I used to walk by as a schoolboy. Some quick calculation soon revealed that I'd only missed seeing him by a matter of months. He was killed just before I started secondary school in the centre of Leeds. He was, however, a large part of my upbringing, because skinheads and racists would regularly taunt me and other non-white citizens with the promise that we're going to do to you what we did to Olawale. As a young boy in Leeds, the name David Olawale was both a warning and a threat. During one of these trips back to Leeds in the 90s, I went into the city library and looked at the contemporary newspaper reports of the events of the Olawale trial. I won't go into details of all that I discovered, but I will say this. I went into the process feeling sorry for this man who had been brutalized and had lost his life. I saw him as a victim. However, when I came out of the other side of the research and the writing, I realized that yes, he was a victim, but he was also much more than this. He was a supreme representative of the tenacity and the courage that all migrants have. He was a man who could have saved himself. If he'd simply left the city, then he would almost certainly have survived. But David Olawale was determined. At dawn, beaten and bedraggled, this man would walk back into Leeds and go straight to the very same shop doorways that the officers regularly found him in. He would make himself visible so that his presence in the city was an act of open defiance. I will participate in the narrative of your city, whether you like it or not. I will be a part of your city. In the end, this Nigerian migrant paid the highest price possible for his tenacity. One final point. It's worth remembering that to date, despite the fact that over 2,000 people have been killed in police custody in Britain since records have been kept, the David Olawale case remains the only case in Britain where the police have been successfully prosecuted in a situation where a citizen has been unlawfully killed whilst in their custody. That this happened in my city during my lifetime still causes me distress and tells me something about the courage of migrants and the difficulties they have to navigate when finding new cities. And what of London? Around this time last year, I found myself spending the greater part of a week in a replica of a boat that was modeled on Conrad's boat from the novel Heart of Darkness. Just to confuse things a little, the boat was moored on the roof of the Queen Elizabeth Hall on the south bank of the Thames. The replica boat was actually an art installation that was part of the Olympic year of cultural celebration in London. 12 writers from around the world had been invited to spend some time in the boat, one each month, and write about whatever took their fancy, what they saw, how they felt, in short, whatever was on their mind as they perched in this boat come hotel room high above the River Thames. The view was magnificent. To the left were the Houses of Parliament, to the front the Savoy Hotel, to the right St. Paul's Cathedral, and further around the bend in the river, the Tower of London. However, I can't really say that I much enjoyed my time perched high above the River Thames. The first night was strangely eerie. It was a night punctuated by unfamiliar sounds, screeching seagulls, wires stretching and singing, wood creaking and popping and snapping, the swishing backwash of water, and the occasional dull bass of a tugboat. And then the noises of the land, Big Ben counting off the hours, the dull hum of traffic on Waterloo Bridge, and garbage carts being noisily trundled across pavements below. At dawn, I was rewarded with the drama of light crashing through the flimsy blinds and the dramatic announcement of a new day. I crawled out of bed and once again took in the extraordinary vista of a 180-degree view of London as she curves around the graceful bend in the river at the heart of the city. I immediately began to think of T.S. Eliot, an American migrant to London, who in The Wasteland wrote memorably of the unreal city of London. Unreal city, under the brown fog of a winter dawn, a crowd flowed over London Bridge, so many. I had not thought death had undone so many. Hardly cheery words, but that foggy, poetic image of London was, strangely enough, what I expected to be gazing down upon. I'd anticipated endless lines of people shuffling across bridges to the left and to the right, with, as Eliot suggests, each man fixing his eyes before his feet and silently going about his business. But that's not the London I saw before me from my elevated vantage point. The fog of the first half of the 20th century has long gone, and I didn't detect much shuffling. In fact, in early 21st century London, people appeared to be dashing purposefully in all directions. But preconceptions are powerful, and we often hold on to them long after reality has intervened. Between 1948 and 1962, over 250,000 West Indians arrived in Britain. British citizens clinging to suitcases, gaudy hats, and with their passports of belonging tucked neatly into their jacket pockets. They were coming to the motherland, and their minds were full of images of the empire's most important city. Marble Arch, Buckingham Palace, Hyde Park Corner, the images were iconic, and knowledge of them suggested participation, a shared history. Possessing these images, being able to recognize these places, and, most importantly, talk about them with the authority of an insider would surely produce a happy encounter with Britain. These early West Indian migrants arrived in Britain holding on to their preconceptions as tightly as they held on to their luggage. Over 50 years later, many of these original pioneer migrants are still living in London. We know what these migrants expected because their testimony is preserved in audio archives and in documentary films. We also know what they expected because of the literature of the period. And perhaps the most evocative and brilliant example of this literature is, again, the Trinidadian writer Samuel Selvon's novel, The Lonely Londoners, first published in 1956. Selvon's main character, Moses, finds himself at the end of the novel standing by the same river that I was now perched high above. Despite the evidence of discrimination, the evidence of poverty and heartbreak that Moses has been forced to endure throughout the book, at the end of the novel, our lonely Londoner is still totally unable to jettison his images of expectation. He stands gloriously still on the banks of the River Thames, knowing that he can't help but love this city that has effectively rejected him and his kind. And somewhat ironically, he comforts himself by lovingly recollecting London's iconic images. "Oh," he says, "I have walked on Waterloo Bridge. I have rendezvoused at Charing Cross." To be able to say Piccadilly Circus is my playground, to say these things, to have lived these things, to have lived in the great city of London, the center of the world, to one day lean against the wind, walking up the Bayswater Road, to see the leaves swirl and dance and spin on the pavement, to write a casual letter home, beginning, "Last night in Trafalgar Square." Selvon's characters grapple with the symbolism of an iconic London, and the protracted and frustrated nature of their struggle suggests deep and unresolved issues around questions of belonging and ownership in the Britain of the period. On my second night, I sat out on the deck of Mr. Conrad's boat, and I looked down at the lights playing on the River Thames. Then I took out my copy of The Lonely Londoners, and I read the first few lines again, feeling the unease and ambivalence in the opening words of the novel. One grim winter evening, when it had a kind of unrealness about London, with the fog sleeping restlessly over the city and the lights showing in the blur, as if it's not London at all, but some strange place on another planet. That's it, exactly, I thought. Some strange place on another planet. For so many people, the possibility of their participating in the type of Britain that these buildings symbolically suggest remains for them about as real as the possibility of their participating in lunar exploration. It's not the fault of the buildings, of course, but it's what the buildings suggest. Exclusivity, privilege, power. Cumulatively, the evidence of the buildings forms a powerful narrative that for many can quickly move from a familiar narrative to one of rejection. Even if one did take the time to learn the actual and symbolic meaning of this resplendent view of the city might well still neither recognize you, let alone embrace you and take you in. Leeds and London are my cities. Over the past few years, I've obviously spent a great deal of time thinking about the story of David Olawale, and I've read and reread the work of Selvon many times. This has led me to some kind of understanding of the plight of colonial migrants, for this is what both Olawale and Selvon were, as were my parents. My family arrived with the understanding that, in an almost literal way, they were going home to Britain. They were going home to the mother country, to the center of the world. And as a result, their sense of expectation, their sense of excitement was high, much, much higher than it would be for a migrant who arrives in a country for economic or for political reasons. However, if things don't work out for colonial migrants, then their sense of betrayal, their sense of outrage, if you like, or in the case of Selvon's characters, their sense of wistful melancholy is that much greater and much, much more painful. Colonial migrants are brought up to think that whatever the capital cities of their countries might be it Lagos or Port of Spain, their real capital city is London. The real center of their world is Britain. This sense of expectancy will make such migrants absorb and soak up a tremendous amount of punishment and humiliation in the name of participation. My generation, the children of the pioneer colonial migrants to Britain, were very different. We didn't trust Britain, and we said, screw you, to participation. As I said at the start of this talk, the evidence for this can be found in the street troubles, or urban insurrection, if you like, that first flared up in the 70s and the 80s, troubles which were exacerbated by the reactionary policies of Margaret Thatcher. We rebelled. We sought alternative homes, the Caribbean, or for the more essentialist, Africa. Neither Leeds nor London, nor for that matter, Manchester or Liverpool or Birmingham or Bristol, were really going to work for my generation. It was during this period of the late 70s and 80s that I began to see Leeds and London as problematic cities that I didn't have to be married to, that I didn't trust. And it's during this time that I was profoundly puzzled by the writing of those migrants who, in the face of overwhelming evidence of rejection, still, for some reason, possessed and professed a loyalty to Britain and her cities. But I now understand that for my parents and for other colonial migrants, to reject Britain would have been to reject a huge part of who they were. They were, in a sense, trapped. I owe a great deal to the people who went before me. I still have great ambivalence about the cities of Leeds and London by the water, and many other cities, but the least I can do, particularly so as a writer, is to honor the struggle of my antecedents by hanging tough, and saying loudly and clearly that the only way you're going to see your city is by looking at it through the prism of me. And what's more, a large part of the success of your newly regenerated 21st century cities is because of the efforts of people like me, the migrant. I gave to you, in terms of my energy, my ideas, my thoughts, my children, and whether you like it or not, I am now you. I say and write this in the hope that you will eventually learn to include me in your vision of who you are. Because when all is said and done, that's what migrants need more than anything else, to be seen for who they are. This is the true beginning of inclusivity and change. Simply look at, see, and learn to recognize the people around you. And understand that their stories nearly always include you. Even stories as poignant and painful as the ones written by Samuel Selvon, who in the late 70s was so fatigued with the struggle to belong in Britain that he migrated a second time, this time to Canada, where he no longer felt that he had to shoulder the burdensome weight of being a colonial migrant. Economic migrant, political migrant, call him what you will. But Samuel Selvon walked with more ease in Toronto than he ever did on the streets of London. Thank you.
So this is your opportunity to ask questions about what you just heard or about one of his novels or other reflective essays. Maybe while people are lining up in great depth at the mics, I could ask you. So now you've migrated a second time to the United States, and I know that you were in New York and living in New York during 9/11. How have things changed since that time in terms of feeling welcome to the city or other newcomers to the city?
This is great. I feel like Usher. So we're just going to flick this back and forth. Well, first of all, there is a kind of mythology about New York, which is deeply a part of the DNA of the city, which is that it's open to everybody. It welcomes the huddled masses from various corners of the globe. That's what the Statue of Liberty suggests. And everybody, myself included, would like to believe that that's the case. I think perhaps, to be perfectly honest with you, Janice, to some extent, when I first moved to New York in the 90s, I not only wanted that to be the case, but some part of me believed that. But, you know, September the 12th was a very different day than September the 11th, if you were brown or Muslim. And it was really distressing and disturbing and to some degree heartbreaking to see the city turn on a great percentage of its population like that. And I found it disturbing. What followed in terms of the various legislative initiatives that were put in place by George Bush, I found more than disturbing. I found it disgraceful, the Patriot Acts. You know, it's the great Russian poet Mayakovsky said, just before he committed suicide, he said, I stepped on the throat of my own song. And I think that's what the United States of America did under George Bush. Because once you start to point the finger at immigrants, once you start to point the finger at migrants, you're essentially cutting off the lifeblood of your society, and you're betraying the principles upon which your society is built.
In the first and only volume of his autobiography, Edward Said describes what he calls his voyage in, from Palestine, from Lebanon, from Egypt, into the belly of the beast, into the United States. But he says at the very end that throughout his life he felt constantly out of place, always betwixt and between, always on the move. And for much of that life, of course, he wasn't allowed to return to occupied Palestine. But yet at the end of that volume, there's a redemptive passage in which he suggests that being out of place as a permanent condition isn't simply one of exile. It's a way of being in the world, which is also creative. Now, I don't mean to minimize the horror and the discrimination and the injustice that colonial migrants experience as a day-to-day part of their lives, including all those whose lives are not documented, who don't achieve voice in poetry or a novel or rap, for that matter. But I wonder if you could say something about the creative side of being out of place, because that was a stunningly creative presentation in its own right. And I'm interested in the creative possibilities that you see being opened up by not being at home in Leeds, not being at home in London.
I think that's a very good point about the kind of situation where you're living with more than one culture, where you're embracing a kind of... Said was a colleague of mine, and so I always thought of him as a kind of compulsively itinerant cosmopolitan. Not to his face, but he created, rather, as many people who lived just in, I'm just trying to think, within 2 blocks of me when in my first apartment in New York in the Village, I was surrounded by compulsive itinerants who were creating creative energy out of trying to synthesize more than one culture. My neighbors were Peter Carey, Joseph Brodsky, Derek Walcott, all people who were living betwixt and between and synthesizing the energy that came from more than one cultural feed to produce something new. Now, the danger of recognizing that and promoting that as a positive thing is that it leaves out the 99.9% of people who have to be rooted, who need a job, who need a roof, whose jobs don't allow them that kind of mobility, who want and have to have a sense of rootedness and a sense of home. There's something about being a creative person which almost welcomes the irresponsibility of itinerants and having it both ways. But most people's lives are not like that. So yes, I do agree with you. I think Said is a very good example of somebody who was creative out of this sense of feeling in between. There are dozens of examples of people who've managed to do that, particularly in the United States. Nabokov, etc. We could go on for a long time listing such people. But most migrant experiences and migrant stories do require a more prosaic response to the world, a rootedness, a job, a house, a school for their children, and they can't really afford to revel in the kind of in the airline lounges which I hang out in, you know.
Hello, Caryl. My name's Shelley Johnson. We're here with the Peter Wall Center doing our work to indigenize the Academy. And where we're meeting today, up until 250 years ago, the people that lived here were the Coast Salish people, the traditional owners of this land that remains unceded and is occupied today because of a lack of treaty. I'm interested to hear your thoughts about being a very young person going to England, leaving your home country where you are rooted, where, I mean, the bodies of your ancestors are that land. And interested to hear you speak a little bit about that sense of place and belonging for you. If it's not Leeds, it's not London, then where is it? Thank you.
Thank you. I wish I'd have grown up in Leeds or in England feeling a sense of that there was a land, as you put it, that there was a place that I could call home. I'll say one thing about immigrant parents is they don't often talk about where they've come from to their children because they often don't want to confuse their children. And my experience with my parents was my constantly asking questions about the Caribbean and then basically telling me to shut up and get on with being in England. My constantly coming home from school and saying this had happened or this is what they called me at school and them telling me to shut up and get on with my homework. So the question of discovering another home, the question of finding a place that was a land that could be safe, it was, in a sense, denied to me, to put it quite bluntly. And I don't think it's an uncommon experience for, as I said, first-generation migrant parents to try and protect their children in this way. I left university determined not to do a proper job. You know, I wanted to write. So I then had the opportunity to go and find out something about who I was. And the first thing I did was buy, with the first money that I got beyond the dole check, was to buy a plane ticket and go to the Caribbean. That's the very first thing I did because I knew that I could never understand who I was by just seeing England. My parents were born in the Caribbean. I was born in the Caribbean. All four of my grandparents were born in the Caribbean. So I had to understand that place if I was going to understand myself. So it was a process of reintroducing myself and rediscovering a land that eventually did have some symbolism and did have some meaning for me in more than just a symbolic way. It had a very practical meaning for me too, because I ended up living there for a while. But it was, I still don't know whether it's the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do to cut your children off from the homeland. I don't know what the right response is, but growing up I did feel I wish I had another alternative to this place, but I didn't. I had to go and find it.
Thanks very much for your talk. In some ways, actually, I have had the opposite experience of what you just described. I identify sort of as a tri-generational byproduct of British colonization. You know, plantations in India ended up in Trinidad, actually, and eventually ended up, now I live on stolen Algonquin territories in what we call Ottawa. The question I wanted to ask you is about picking up on the idea of the colonial migrant that you talked about, and then maybe teasing out some of the similarities the colonial migrant might have with what you talked about as economic migrants. And I think they're related. I want to see what you think about this. I think they're related through lies. They're related through what seems to motivate both the economic migrant and the colonial migrant, because my father, my mother, everyone, they had the same kind of idea of the grandeur of London, you know, everything that you just described. But we also had this disassociated sense of home was always Trinidad. Everything was about Trinidad the whole time growing up. But it's, I think, because they were educated. My parents were educated in British colonial education that told them the lie that I think held the colonies together through the Age of Empire, which was, we can all become British one day. You know, we can all earn the right to that kind of Western European modernity. And David Oluwole made himself visible to that society that lied to him and all of the colonized people from the area that he came from, and they killed him, it sounds like. They killed him for trying to claim what was promised to him through the processes of colonial education. So I'm wondering, you know, I guess what you think about the relationships between that and today's economic migrants. You know, in Canada today, we lock up economic migrants for trying to get into the country, like the Tamil migrants now who are being held for being Tamil. And I'm wondering how you think society can actually kind of go beyond seeing the migrants and actually accounting for the kind of legacy of lies that have brought the migrants here. So thanks for your talk.
Well, thanks for your question. I'm going to answer it very briefly. Do you want to say something else? No. All right. I'm going to answer it very briefly because I'm not a social scientist, so I can't answer the last bit, what do we do? I don't know, but they're obviously related, colonial migration, economic migration, and political migration. They're not three separate bunkers into which you jump into that one or that one or that one. Colonial migrants were economic migrants too. You know, my parents came to England because they wanted a job and they wanted to make some money. But yes, today's economic migration is some of the same lies, to use your term. Some of the same mythology is still sold to people to come to the promised land and to work, and it turns out to be as bogus as it was for the colonial migrants that I was talking about. So they're not dissimilar at all. And I think I said it towards the beginning of the talk. I hope that by looking at the case of colonial migration, it would throw some light on all forms of migration because they are interrelated. I just want to come back to the point the lady made over there, because as you were talking, I remembered something when you said the thing about what we call, or what is supposedly called Ottawa. The most puzzling thing that happened to me when I went to St. Kitts for the first time was I heard people calling it Lyomega, and I didn't know what this was. And I kept hearing this term until I realized, of course, it's the original Carib name for the island. So I said, you know, what happened to the people? Well, what happened was genocide. So going there didn't just open me to some notion of the Caribbean. It complicated questions of identity and belonging and land, and it becomes very difficult, I think, for anybody to sensibly look at all of the Caribbean without understanding the history of that region, because the history of that region is built on genocide. It's all of those islands have another name, the same as the same as you go around all of North America. Manhattan, it's not an English word. St. Christopher, what's that? That's imposed. So it really complicated the notion of home and belonging and made me feel, well, okay, yes, but that's only since 1493. What happened before?
Thank you very much for your talk. I'm not sure if this is a good question. You use the phrase loyalty to a city, and I wonder what you mean by that and why you would not use the word love for a city, which thinking about Milton Glazer's logo for New York City, where you have the I Heart New York, seems to be perhaps the more common way of thinking about a person's feeling for a city.
What was the first thing you said, sorry? Use the phrase what?
Yeah, loyalty to a city. Loyalty.
What context did I use that? I can't remember.
You use it throughout your talk in the migrants having loyalty to London,
Right.
Or to the colonial capital.
And so you're saying that it's more than that?
No, I'm just curious to see why you just what do you mean by that and why?
Because I think, sorry, I understand what you're saying. I'm sorry for being so slow. It's kind of related to what the gentleman at the back was saying from Trinidad. You're sold a bill of goods that part of your way forward in society is to be loyal to the flag, is to be loyal to the notion of that particular identity, to there's all sorts of ways of being treacherously disloyal as a colonial subject. What's the word that was most commonly used to me as a kid growing up? I was ungrateful. For what? The English language is full of these pitfalls, but yeah, you're supposed to be loyal. You're supposed to exhibit a certain type of performance in the way in which you comport yourself towards Britain. And to not do that is to display a certain ingratitude, to display a certain lack of loyalty, to display a certain kind of behavior which will be punished. I mean, you'll be punished for it, or you may well be punished for it. There's a reason why it's called the motherland, because there's a terrible kind of maternal-paternal relationship where you're going to be spanked if you don't behave properly. So that's really why that's what I was saying. I did mention the word love in the context of Selvon's characters because he uses the word love. And it's a very powerful and very disturbing word to use because it's almost, it feels to me sometimes when I'm reading his work and the work of other writers of that generation that it's like the kind of helpless love that one has for a step-parent who is actually treating one badly. And yet you feel obliged to continue showing that same degree of loyalty and behaving properly in the hope that one day, you too will get a Christmas present.
This might relate to the last question, but just in terms of the family dynamic, how did your parents' generation respond to the rebellion of your generation?
I can only talk about my parents. I mean, I don't know. I suppose every parent's response. My parents were kind of not comfortable. I think they'd given up on me, to be honest. I mean, they knew I was a bit of a vagabond, and so they weren't surprised that I was at Notting Hill Carnival misbehaving. There was a certain degree of shame, I think, that we were letting the side down. But personally, my parents already knew that there was some issues. But generationally, I think, there was a sense that you're letting the side down, that this isn't the right way to respond. Secretly, they went through stuff, they absorbed things that we were not prepared to absorb. So I like to think that secretly at some point when the door was closed late at night that they thought, good. But I never was told that to my face. There was a lot of...
Good evening, and thank you for your lecture and your talk this evening. First question. In reading Barack Obama's book, Dreams from My Father, there's a scene where he goes back to Kenya at the end, and he's standing on safari, which is something his sister has told him Kenyans don't do. And he's standing next to a man whose parents were originally from England, and they had lived in Kenya. This man had been born and raised in Kenya during colonialism. And he tells Obama that he's gone back home to England, and he doesn't feel as though he's home. He feels very out of place in England, and so they end up migrating to Mali in the end. And the interesting thing there is that here is Obama, who has been told his whole life that he is Kenyan because he is the son of a Kenyan immigrant, and this man who's being told that he's English the whole time, though he feels very much as though he's Kenyan. And Ernest Gellner writes that two men are of the same nation when they can recognize each other for their shared culture and their shared history. So how does this relate to a multicultural nation, such as the one you currently reside in, and the one that we currently reside in, though there are two different forms of multiculturalism?
That's a great question, but I can't answer it. I don't know. When I hear the word multicultural, it has it means so many different things in so many different places. I mean, the first half of what you're saying, I'm not ducking your question. I am, but I'm not. The first half of your question is actually, I think, really fascinating, because that notion of colonialism, it didn't just affect people from the colonies, it affected the colonized too. Great works of literature, be they written by, I mean, the late, she died recently, Ruth Prover-Jabala, Paul Scott, Staying On. There are any number of great pieces of literature about the confusion of identity for white and non-white people around this issue of colonialism. One of my favorite writers, Jean Rhys, is brilliant on this subject. So I do think that picture that you painted of Obama and standing next to the guy who went back to England and then came, it's part of the, depending on whether you're an optimist or a negative or a pessimist, you can either see it as part of the rich, positive possibilities of the colonial experiment, or you can see it as one of the tragedies that it has created such profound confusion of identity and belonging in so many different people of so many different races and backgrounds. I mean, I prefer to be an optimist and see it as a positive thing, but it is a very fair point you're making. And I hope that means that I've eloquently ducked the multicultural question.
Thank you again. This has been an absolutely fascinating evening, and I have many, many questions to ask, but I just want to ask one, and that is about the sort of positioning of your immigrant story, in as much as, at least in the United States, in the contemporary context, there's a lot of narratives about when parents migrate, they make enormous sacrifices. They know they've moved to an unequal society. They know they experience enormous amounts of violence and hatred, but they do it because they expect that, having gotten a foothold in this society, they can create opportunities for their children that their children would not experience where they're from. And what is odd about this evening is that could be the narrative that you presented to us. I mean, your own personal narrative, the struggles that your parents went through, and the life that you've ultimately had as a result of where you grew up, as opposed to what it had been. I'm wondering, why does that narrative enter, or does that possibility enter your sort of autobiography, or do you reject it for reasons that, does it just not fit at all? I mean, I'm curious.
No, it's a very good point. The narrative you're talking about, I would characterize as the narrative of a migrant who has gone to a new society with a deep determination that they're going to make it possible for their children to succeed in this place. They're going to soak up a lot of grief, a lot of punishment, if necessary. If they're not necessarily going to be forced to do so, but if necessary, they will, because they're going to make a space in themselves in that society for themselves, and move their family and principally their children forward. That's very much a narrative that you can see inscribed in much literature, as you rightly said, in the United States, and in this country too. It does exist in Britain. There are countless stories of people who have gone and made those sacrifices, but the narratives that are equally prevalent are those of people whose lives have become shipwrecked because of expectation. When members of my family came to Canada to migrate, they had the blinkers on. They knew why they were coming to Canada. There was no kind of, the streets will be paved with gold, everybody will love me. No, they were coming to Canada for a reason. Similar, same members of my family who went to the United States to migrate. They had no rosy tinted spectacles that they were looking through, but members of my family who went to Britain, I think that they had to get over something because of the baggage of expectation that they were carrying with them, like an extra piece of luggage that they'd checked. Some members of my family who went to Britain left in the 60s and in the early 70s and came to Canada. They had what I tend to think of now as assimilation fatigue. They just thought, sod it, we're out of here. But it took them a long time to get to that stage. Did they fare better here? than they would have done in Britain. I don't know. That's up to every individual, but I do know for sure that many of the narratives, I think including some of my own personal, history, is ensnared on that whole question of expectation and betrayal. I would have thought that now, 50 years after my mother brought me to England in her arms, she'd have got over it. But a few years ago, I won the Commonwealth Prize for Literature, and part of that prize is an audience with the Queen. And you know what I said, because, as I said, they had me pegged as a troublemaker a long time ago. I'm like, no, I don't want to meet the Queen. I'm not meeting the Queen, blah, blah, blah. And of course I didn't. And I remember when I saw my mother afterwards, and I saw the way she was looking at me, and I was thinking, still? So I think it takes a long time for people to put that stuff to one side.
Good evening. I also was born in Leeds. And I was also taken to London, and I grew up there, but of Italian parents. And what you describe really isn't very different to when I was growing up. Things have changed a bit, but what you describe nearly sounds the story of my childhood and girlhood until I came to Canada.
Well, I'm happy to meet somebody else who came from Leeds. I mean, I don't know if this is your experience in Leeds, but one of the things that has always given me an ongoing affection about Leeds is the people who taught me, is my teachers. And Leeds took in a lot of refugees from Nazi Germany. And it took in a lot of Polish people,
Yes.
resistance after the Second World War, and they were my teachers. And in a sense, those guys, and I still know their names, I can still see their faces, they recognized there was a kind of outsider trauma bonding that was going on that I didn't know. I didn't know why they were pushing me harder than the other kids. So it's a complicated thing. It's not just a city of rejection, which is why I was trying to talk about it. You have to see it as a city of migration too. It has a history. It has a long history of taking in people from outside, and a lot of those people recognize each other.
It's also the era. My grandparents came from Italy in Victorian times. So a lot of changes come. Some are not changed, but a lot have changed. But I hadn't met anybody from Leeds who grew up in London. So London is still my special. I've never been back to Leeds. So I'm missing something?
Well, regenerated Leeds has now rebranded itself with the unlikely name of the Barcelona of the North. So I think you're not missing anything.
Thank you. Lovely.
I'm not sure how to approach it, but I had, I guess, part of your sense of loneliness was being the only part of such a minuscule Afro-Caribbean community in Leeds, and but later in London, and certainly nowadays it's much expanded. My experience was sometimes where I would get on, say, a subway car in Toronto at 5:30 in the morning, and I would be the only white person on the car, and everyone else would be black, and very often there were, I guess, either cleaning officers or working in the hospitals where they'd have those early hours. And my grandmother washed floors for a living in the Depression and whatnot, and raised 4 children. So there are other people who go through difficulties as well, but maybe don't push their children as hard. And so, but what I wonder about is the connection with the countryside. Like, your parents probably were not urbanites in St. Kitts, or were they? So, I mean, there was more of, even if they lived in a town, they probably had a nice garden, and they were, the sense of nature is very different. So very often what we get in Canada is people who are either urban poor or from other countries who don't have the same connection with the countryside that other people do.
Yeah, I mean, my parents were like most people who migrated from the Caribbean. They were, I mean, it's a slightly pejorative term, but they were country people. They weren't town people. And then they came to a hellishly urban environment, which, you know, some of which I tried to describe in my talk. You know, you're going to a very grim industrial town in many ways. And, you know, my father's first job was on the railways, and the second job was in a steel mill, an iron mill, a forge. It never occurred to me till I went back to the West Indies that, of course, I didn't know, but his father was a groom on a plantation. So that the visual, the sensual move was profound. But that was the case, I think, for many migrants. As far as loneliness is concerned, you know, try going to Oxford. You know?
I think we have time for one more question.
Thank you for your talk. It was really very good. And what I appreciated about it is how much it brought into the same talk so many of my favorite, a couple of my favorite writers. Edward Said, from whom I first learned the different ways of being an outsider, exile, expatriate, refugee, and all those different immigrants. And today you brought in colonial migrants, so I really appreciated that. And of course, Joseph Conrad, who wrote Heart of Darkness. I've obsessed over that story for years and years. What I really appreciated that you went to the boat, Conrad's boat, and had some thoughts about it. But I was hoping you'd speak a little bit about, and you don't have to, about Conrad's own experience as a migrant, as a Polish migrant to Britain, who tried so hard to assimilate, mastered the language, and then his character, Marlowe, whose boat that was, sort of, went to the Congo and, you know, saw what the empire was doing. And so we stand now, and I really like the end of your talk when you say, we are you. So this is what the empire did out there, this is the result of it. So.
Well, first of all, the Conrad story that I like the best is probably the one that you know Said wrote about, Joseph Andrews. Said wrote a very good essay about the story about a man who turns up in England, on the south coast of England, a European of some description who can't speak the language and marries somebody, and it's a very good story, and it's a good essay as well. But it's about the pain of trying to belong, which Conrad was a master at writing about and exploring. But this is a man who's writing in his third language. But Conrad's Heart of Darkness, without wishing to do too much self-advertising, is Chinua Achebe was a good friend of mine, and I had a long conversation with Achebe, which is published I think it's in my last book. I think it's one of the essays, and it's about basically me sitting and trying to talk to Achebe about Heart of Darkness. Achebe hates that book. And I was trying to say, I don't think you're right, which is kind of a tough thing to say to somebody like Chinua. But we came to some understanding, I think, or at least he was kind enough to pretend that we'd come to some understanding. So, you know, I'm sort of on the record as saying to what I think about Heart of Darkness, and my feelings are not nearly as negative as Achebe's. But at the same time, my feelings about Conrad generally are quite positive, because to me he's a quintessential example of much of the best British writing over the last century and a half has been produced by British writers who were not born in Britain. I edited an anthology in the 90s called Extravagant Strangers, which is an anthology entirely made up of canonical British literature: Orwell, Eliot, Conrad, Selvon, Kipling, Jean Rhys, and then you could come up closer to the present with Naipaul, Ishiguro, etc. A huge percentage of British literature is written by people who were not born in Britain and who therefore have some kind of a perspective on what it means to be slightly outside. But I think the grandfather of the tradition, certainly in prose, to me, is Conrad.
So, I just want to say on behalf of all of us, thank you for your most thoughtful remarks and your willingness to engage with all of us. And I want to thank all of you for coming and for your thoughtful comments. And have a good evening. Thank you.